IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. As those of you who've been following this show for a while might know, at Takshashila every Thursday we tend to have what we call a tank scrub, where the entire think tank sits down and scrubs their minds for interesting ideas. The one thing that came up in our most recent tank scrub was this idea of a kind of 0 year for education. Now, what does that entail, I hear you ask? Well, a 0 year basically means that this entire year, 2020, a year which saw India battling its most deadly pandemic in recent history, which saw massive disruption to jobs, to employment, to academics, and most importantly, a pandemic that kind of unequally affected different aspects of society and the economy, brought up the question of how do we come up with an equitable solution to the inequitable costs that the pandemic has imposed on all of us. Now, one potential idea that we had was this idea of a 0 year, where basically the entire academic year of 2020 counts for absolutely nothing. So if, for example, you entered the 6th grade in the beginning of 2020, you are once again going to enter the 6th grade in the beginning of 2021. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you who are listening to this already have a lot of ideas as to why that might work or why that might not work. I have with me today my colleagues Saurabh Modi and Atish Padhy. Hey guys.
Hi Anirudh.
Hi Anirudh.
So this is both Saurabh's and Atish's debut podcast. Just letting you all know that through this podcast, if you hear me referring to Modi ji at any point, it's not going to be our honorable Prime Minister, but rather Saurabh. So once again, welcome both of you. And let's get started. So let's get to this business of what this 0 year in academics actually means. Modi ji, over to you. What is a year 0? What might it actually entail for India students?
Right. So without taking up the burden of the real Modi ji, the thought process is an open question that we've been pondering about. So there are a few things which we don't have definite answers to, but it looked like an interesting and important exercise to take up. So the first thought is how do we go about defining a timeline? So when we say the word year 0, how many months are we looking at? The academic year calendar is completely disrupted. A lot of people have entered college much later on than they usually do. A lot of people will finish schools, exams are going to be delayed. So that is something to iron out. And another open question is, how are we thinking about this to be applicable to which level of education? Is it just the primary level which needs a year 0? A secondary level finds it as important? And how are we thinking about this for people who have graduated from school and are looking to start college? And a very important part of this is the cost component, and who's paying for this extra year 0? Are the parents having to shell off more money than they would? Or are we looking for some interesting solution coming otherwise? That's another open question which needs pondering. And how are we thinking about what education kids have already had? So whatever at the margins students have managed to learn, are we going to take that into account, or are we going to completely discount? These are some open questions that we may or may not have answers to, but are important to define and think of. And I think Atish has an interesting understanding of why even consider it. So Atish, why do you think that a year 0 is relevant, and why should we even consider this? For some people, this could be completely a bizarre thought.
So hi Saurabh, and great points that you made. But the reason why I think it's important for us to even consider such a drastic measure as declaring a 0 year is because this pandemic is unprecedented. And although that's a cliche to say, it's a cliche thing to say, but the reason why I think that is so is if you look at all the past events of this scale, any other crisis, none of them have had such great unequal effects, right? The existing inequalities in these countries were made worse by the pandemic. And this is reflected very much in the education sector as well. So, for example, As someone that just got out of college earlier this year, I can speak from my own experience, even though I'm rather privileged, that for a lot of people, what this pandemic meant was it gave them new opportunities because you save time in commuting, you save time from, because earlier university hours or school hours used to be 6, 7 hours a day. Now they have reduced it because it's all online classes to 3 or 4. So that gives you extra time and therefore you can utilize it in different ways. But that does not work the same way for everyone. For a lot of people, especially in poorer parts of India, or even in cities belonging to families that have a lot of kids, so if they have a lot of siblings, even if you do save that time, the very fact that you get access to a device with internet becomes a problem because there'll be sibling infighting as to who gets to use the internet. Often classes will clash. So what often happens is women, for example, or girls in households can be denied access to the internet because their brothers would be preferred if their education clashes at the same time. And that is extremely problematic. And that is just one aspect of the entire issue. Similarly, for some people, the effects of the pandemic are much worse on a mental health level. So even if their peers are doing very well through the pandemic because they can intern online or learn a new skill, for them, the very fact that they have to be living inside their houses, locked up, can take a great toll on their mental health. Similarly, a lot of people do not belong to families that are well off, not just financially, but also, they're not peaceful families. If you belong to a broken family, for example, or where you are in a family where your parents are in constant conflict with each other, or it's an abusive household, that also takes a toll. And we need to take all of these into consideration when education has now been outsourced to something that most people do not even have access to, which is technology, which is the internet, which is smartphone devices. Which is why it's very important for us to even consider this, because education is a great leveler. We might have a lot of problems in India in our education system, but it is not very difficult to understand that education is the way in which many people, millions across the country, have made their lives better. And which is why I think such a drastic measure does have a case for itself.
Right, that makes sense. And we're hearing a number of stories where one household has at most one cell phone for 3 kids, and they may not have a consistent access to internet. So that's something to worry about. And there's some assumption we made when the start of the pandemic that everyone will have some kind of access, or it will be possible to make that access possible. And in that assumption, a lot of people got left behind, which is quite the story with India, with a lot many social facets. But despite that, I think we've got to put a hat of a policymaker and do a cost benefit analysis that if we're doing something, an intervention of this scale, what could be the possible cost and what could be the possible benefit. And as often the answer that turns out may not be the best that we desire. I mean, it could be a completely different story that these numbers can say. So, in just starting from off the bat, I think the cost would be different for different people. It would be different for parents. It would be different for children. It will be different for institutions. But the most important stakeholder here are the learners themselves, the children. So for primary education, the difficulty is that an additional schooling year may look like a smaller burden, but it's difficult to articulate the problem that may be around. One number that captures this is that the average schooling of an Indian citizen is only 5.1 years. The story this number tells us that education is something which is an extremely rare commodity and very difficult to attain for a lot many people. And if we add on to the burden of a year which was not considered and having to start or repeat something, a person may just be willing to drop off getting educated altogether. So we may just lose so many children who may not want to get back to education altogether, which is something which is a big cost, which can set us back quite a number of ways. And for secondary education, I think an obvious cost, which is easy to see, is a delayed entry to colleges. I mean, it can be easily discouraging, and kids may or may not want to take up this additional cost. While there may be a few unseen costs, but from just a cursory thought, this could be the easiest cost. And for higher education, I think the costs are severe because the opportunity cost of education at any point of time is what you're not doing with that time. So, if you're studying an additional year of college, you're not entering the job market. And if you're delaying that year, your entry to job market is delayed further. And that opportunity cost, given the state of our income, is something which is very important to consider. A lot of stories about an average Indian who's goes like this: that they're entering engineering college, waiting the number of years to finish it. The moment they get it, they jump to a city to try getting a job, and having to redo another year will have huge repercussions in terms of the contribution to the family wealth, in terms of personal income to that person. So I think if we're thinking about who should we do this, the opportunity cost increases for people who are just about to enter the job market. And finally, I think institutions have a different challenge to face, given how they may need to build an extra capacity for the children who are having to repeat and the children who are not having to repeat. So if we, on some metric, wonder that maybe kids who are about to finish their 12th grade need to do better on their assessment and they alone must have to go through this year zero. This means instead of grades 1 to 12, we now have 1 to 12 plus 1, another grade to work with. And things in the capacity front of our schools is dismal. The average schools are having trouble with classrooms, with teachers, with limited and scarce resources. So I'm guessing that's another cost to think about. And finally, for parents, of course, it may mean that they have to shell out a substantial amount of money on education. I mean, sometimes a family's about a third of a family's income can just go in educating their children. So that's a substantial cost that we thinking of when we refer to something like this.
Right, so thank you for that. Thank you for that summary of the costs involved, Saurabh. And like the more I think about it, like even though clearly we do need some kind of solution to even out the question of the equity of education because of the unequal effects that the pandemic has had, which Atish summarized a few minutes ago. These costs really act as a bit of a splash of cold water, at least in my personal opinion, because just realistically speaking, I find it difficult to believe that Indian schools have the capacity for this, especially given what he said about how education can be a leveler. It's the people on the margins who are going to be most affected, right? So if, for example, a family has taken a massive loan to get their kid through an expensive engineering course so they can go and work in the US and help pay off their family's debt, they might not be able to afford another year of education at these kind of prices, and therefore potentially miss a chance at like entering the middle classes, which perhaps will not come again for years. Again, so it's a little difficult to see the positive aspect of what a measure like this might entail. What are your thoughts on this, Atish? So what potentially does India have to gain from going through with this idea of a 0 year?
So, of course, as you mentioned, the costs do seem overwhelming, but the clear case for benefits would be that just imagine you are someone that is in the last year of college, right? Just taking forward your own analogy. And you are to enter the job market. And you are in, say, third or fourth year, right? And that's a very crucial time for you to build your skills that you will employ in the job market. And now if you enter the job market without these skills, in the short term, yes, you can help your parents get through the loan debt that they have. But the problem is that we always think about these things in the short term. Of course, there's a huge cost in the short term. But when you do not have entry-level skills in the market and you still somehow get a job, assuming that you do, which I'm not sure you will, after you do get a job, what happens next? Because if you do not even have that basic set of skills, then the possible progress that you could make through your career is not going to happen. And that is going to have much more cost eventually. So if your potential was to, earn X amount of money over 10 years, and now you end up earning X by 2 over 10 years, because of the fact that you missed out on a crucial year of education where you could build skills, that's a cost that is hidden and we don't see it. So it's a clear case of the cost being immediate and the benefits being down the line, and which is why it's easy for us to short down an idea of a drastic case. Similarly, we can make a case here that it's not the case that everyone is missing out on skills, because there are other ways to build skills. But as I pointed out initially, that the pandemic has been very unequal in many regards, and therefore it's not possible for everyone to build skills when they are not in college. And when thinking of it from a privileged urban point of view, it might be easy for us to consider this argument to not be as strong. But if we take semi-urban or rural areas where people pursue professional degrees or any college degree or in school, for them the cost of developing skills in other ways is too much, because the reason why they go to college is to get an entry-level job in any way, right? And if you are denying them that because of the fact that now classes are online, or because your college was shut down arbitrarily, because we are not looking at the fact that a lot of colleges and schools in India are just not conducting classes at all. A lot of them have online classes, but a lot of them just have been arbitrarily closed since April and May. And there is no clarity about what the future of those students is going to be. So if we do not have a leveling policy that levels out the entire thing, then what we run the risk of doing is that for certain people who have access, it gets even better. They can actually get much better at the job market, while other people that depend on college for some sort of education, but their colleges are not working or are not providing them with proper education, they miss out entirely. So existing inequities, not just in access and opportunity, but also in outcomes, just becomes much, much worse. And I think as policymakers or as the government, one of the major roles is during a crisis that you ensure that the crisis does not have effects over a very long period of time. Because now you are handling the crisis and you do whatever you need to do for that. And after maybe 25, 30 years, you understand that your policies, because of this, had very adverse effects in increasing levels of poverty or inequality in this country. And which is why one of the benefits is that there are other benefits to the fact that a lot of places have conducted online exams, or they are going through the motions of teaching, even though it's not really teaching, and they provide them with a syllabus that is 30% of what it's supposed to be, and then you write an exam and get through that. That also has adverse effects in the way that, in addition to not being able to build skills, if you are among the few people that choose to go to higher education, then your chances of getting into a better college in the future also drop. Because not just in the level of skill, you just do not know other basics of how to maybe write a research paper or how to formulate an argument. From my own example, I have a lot of juniors who are in college now, and for all of them that are in third year, for example, and they are about to enter the industry, third year is the most crucial time when they're actually taught those skills that they would need when they go out. And that is just entirely gone, because you can't really do, for example, things that require a lab, for example, video editing, or if you are in a design course, or if you're a medical student, right? So how do you compensate for that lab work that you've missed out? Because you can't do lab work over Zoom. And if we look at all of this, the long-term costs of not having it seems to me to be comparable to the short-term costs of having a 0 year.
Okay, fascinating. And yeah, I mean, inequality and the perpetuation and the widening of inequality is definitely a big downside to not having a policy like this. So both of you have laid out a fairly compelling case. On the one hand, having an equitable policy seems to be extremely difficult to implement given the challenges that India faces. On the other hand, not doing anything risks further dividing the gap between the rich and the poor, which already exists and is going to continue to widen in India if nothing is done. So how do we kind of weigh these two against each other? Do you have any thoughts, Saurabh?
Before I really answer that question, I would want to take a step back. So when we are thinking about changing something, it's equally important to understand what things are at the moment. So when we say the education levels are going to be dismal, it's going to be bad, there's going to be a lot of inequity, the wealthy people have access to great education, poor people have dismal understanding, we also have to see what are we assessing and comparing it with. So let's throw in another number here for context. Most kids, say in grade 7, aren't able to solve a simple elementary math problem. Right? I mean, this is a NASA report gave us an understanding of how dismal these numbers are. Most kids by grade 8 aren't able to read as proficiently as they must be able to, given the amount of training we spent on them. And you realize that the per student expenditure made by the government on these on education is maybe more, if not at par, with what most private schools spend. So here we grappling with a system which already makes use of a lot of resources but has no output. And what I'm trying to say is, pandemic or not, things were as bad, and they still are. And the pandemic has made what is bad worse, but the solution is not to allow kids to go back to a bad system and assume that the worst will get fixed by making them repeat something which is already broken. So there's a hidden assumption we make here that there's great education. We've missed on this. Now, you know what? Let's redo it and make up for lost time. That's not really how things are. The things at ground may possibly be something like you did not really get great education. Most of your school days had an absentee teacher. There was no real learning that took place in the classroom when the teacher showed up. And you know what? There's been a pandemic. So let's redo this dismal situation all over again. So this doesn't really help us or take us anywhere. And I think there's a very handy Churchill quote that comes in here, that you must make sure that you never waste a good crisis, right? And if anything, this pandemic is that moment where we have a moment to triumph over the bad systems and maybe reinvent things as we are. And we've had something exactly like that a couple of months ago when the new education policy gathered steam. I mean, there was a lot of talk about how it's going to be a game changer. Some great thoughts plugged in by the economist Karthik Shashidhar made news. And if you just assess what ambitions and goals that particular policy had, maybe we'll have to maybe it will be a chance for us to assess that the year zero may not be needed or required at all if we manage to carry on those reforms, so that what was broken gets fixed and things are better off. So I think that's my particular take to maybe see that we should not even be worrying so much about the cost, benefit, and inequities, because what we are asking them to redo is already broken. So why push someone back in the same hole? And it may not help. The outcome may not come out as we want.
Anyway, so while that does make sense, it is clear from the NEP document itself that they want to make these reforms by 2040, right? And the pandemic is happening in 2020. So the major problem is, yes, you need reforms. Yes, the system is broken, and giving it a 0 year is not going to fix those problems. All of that is true. But you can't also say in the same breath that you can make the system better by using this crisis, because to make those changes, India does not have the state capacity at all, right? If we do not have the state capacity to enforce a 0 year, then how can we have the state capacity to bring out reforms that were planned in the document that overestimates India's state capacity, like every policy document, for 2040 to be done within the short run because we have a crisis? Because that is my concern, right? Is it not better to go back to a bad system from a worse situation than to do nothing and let the situation worsen and continue worsening over the years? One of the examples, which is not related to education at all, on the long-term effects of a huge crisis is the sex ratio in Russia, right? So under Stalin, when the Soviet Union went to war during the Second World War, and we know the Soviet machinery for war, right? They had the highest casualty figures in the entirety of Europe, in all parties involved during the Second World War. The situation was so severe that of all the men born in the year 1922, I think around 70% of them were dead in one of the cities in Russia. And even today, if you look at Russia's sex ratio, the number of women in Russia outnumber the number of men by so much that is not explained at all by the sex ratio at birth. And that clearly explains the long-term effects of a single big crisis. And that is just in terms of raw numbers of how many people survive. And this has to do with something much more complex than just surviving, which is education and your long-term life benefits and how much wealth you accrue and what you do. Of course, you can have an incremental measure to tackle the inequalities, like, have bridge courses, for example, where you pass this year with 30% of your syllabus. You don't really learn anything, but you pass because anyone can pass an online exam by cheating. And I have done it myself, so I can tell you that it's very easy to do it. So you can do all of that and pass. You're not really learning anything, but eventually you have a bridge course, and that adds to the curriculum in the next years. And that makes people that are slow learners or require help, and that is unfair to them, because for no fault of their own, now they have to undergo, and after a year where they were taught nothing, extra syllabus, and then they miss out on even more educational outcomes. So I don't buy the argument that if a system is bad and now it's becoming worse, that we cannot go back to bad, because bad is still better than worse. And our target should be to not make the bad worse.
So I think that's very perceptive of you, Atish, to say that there is a long run and a short run to everything. And the long run is something always missed. And short run is easy to figure out and put into perspective, and that's how we make policies. Maybe there is more to thinking about this. And for instance, when we came up with this idea of NEP, the goal 2040 really doesn't mean much. It's just a number of till when you want to implement it. And the argument made is that, oh, look, we have a limited state capacity, let's not be ambitious. And most goals made by the government can be pushed from 2020 to 2040 to 2060 to whatever. But the key part about NEP, which makes it possible to implement quickly, is the concept of decentralization, where we are actually taking into account the idea that state capacity is not a hindrance anymore, because we don't want the state to go and start implementing it. We are empowering people in local communities and institutions to execute this problem and make solutions that they think are possible. So what I want to do is quickly put together the interesting feature of this decentralization that is rare and unique in NEP, how the government is thinking, and how it can solve education system faster than having to wait for 2040. And finally, how the idea of a year zero can get accomplished without having to redo the year zero. So quickly, decentralization is on each level, on the primary school level, on the secondary school level, and on the higher education front. So what they propose is they make clusters of schools, give a particular principal or a head of a cluster the idea, and empower them with designing the curriculum, figuring out the metrics, and changing things as in how are required for that community level. So now let's see how this will play out in reality. So if we're in a remote village of Rajasthan or any other state for that matter, let's say Bihar, and 4 or 5 institutions that make part of the particular education system come together and say that, listen, this year has been dismal, kids didn't really study anything on the tablet. What we'll have to do is that kids who are in grade 6 will have to take up the core things of grade 5. We'll have to internalize that as a system and redo the assessment as we thought it would. Right? So this is something decentralized. And this could be different for some schools in Mumbai, where they could be like, looks like we have achieved a 50% success rate in communicating the ideas we had to. So what we'll do is redo only the 50% of concepts that are required in grade 6, but the kids still go to the next level of education. And this system can be tweaked and changed by anyone and everyone according to this, where the state doesn't have to dictate universally and spend its capacity to tell what to do, what not to do. In fact, executing a year zero needs more state capacity than allowing schools and institutions to recalibrate education. Something similar on the higher education level, where colleges have an autonomy, where they can dictate that, okay, you know what, there are 15 skills that we thought we'll teach our kids so that they get a job. Out of that, 10 are essential, which we think they need to know before they get into a job. And 5 are something maybe they can pick up in the job. To make sure that they go past the entry barrier, let's focus on those 10 core skills. And then you do go ahead and do that. And I think education institutions can definitely execute this because of an example at hand. And this is something where I personally saw this play out. So law schools in Maharashtra are notorious for being extremely bad at conducting exams, evaluation, and school curriculum. Mumbai University has an extremely bad repute when it comes to assessment of kids. So for the longest time during the pandemic, as things were playing out, the politics was figuring out. A lot of universities raised their hands and said, you know what, we are not going to conduct an exam. We don't have the capacity to do that. We'll not be able to execute it. And the matter went to Supreme Court. There was a quick order passed, and the order said that, listen, we don't really care. You have 1 month. Within this 1 month, you have to assess all the kids. You have to do a viva for all the children. You have to declare results. And this is all the time you get. And suddenly, Mumbai University came up with an understanding that, okay, we're going to make this decentralized. There will be an autonomy. 5 colleges will form a cluster. They will figure out all the logistics themselves, right? From what software to use to conduct the exam, what questions to set for conducting that exam. It turned out that some colleges had covered only 50% of the syllabus, some had conducted 75% of the syllabus. So every college had a different kind of evaluation based on what their kids had learned and what their kids did not learn. And Zoom calls instantly became a phenomenon. All teachers could conduct their vivas and make sure that the kids worked hard on it. And the result also came out in due time. And the secret sauce to all of this happening was empowering those colleges and trusting them with making that system work. So by that metric, the last thought I want to say is that if we think about getting a reform in place like decentralizing things and really trying to change how education it is and make use of this crisis to improve on something which is completely and horribly broken, we may be able to achieve much more than what a year zero will give us. So instead of saying that the outcomes which were supposed to be learned in one particular year, maybe the kids may be able to go way beyond it. Maybe kids who get out of college will have skills which they wouldn't have had without the reform. And this is something which we are thinking across the board. This could be for agriculture, this could be for a ton of other sectors. But necessarily for education, it is much more important because I completely empathize with what Atish is saying, with how education is the most important component and the great leveler. And hence, this reform, I believe, can help fix a lot of those problems that we're trying to solve with the year zero concept.
But Saurabh, I think there's a clear divide between the principle you're arguing for and the example you gave. Because in the example you gave, the outcome seems to be that colleges want to have exams. Okay, and I don't see how that outcome is actually tied with the skill sets they want to develop. And that has been happening in a lot of colleges. So in private colleges across the country, they have conducted online exams. And that was the point also what I was making. Because I went to Christ University, which is a private college, and we did have our exams on time, 2 months later than it was supposed to be, but much before Delhi University or anything else. But that exam in itself is pointless, right? So I agree with you in principle that yes, if you decentralize things and do and like focus on the outcomes and see that you don't have to have a nationwide measure to tackle something that could be handled locally. The example just seems to be counterproductive to your own principle, because leaving it to colleges also makes the fundamental problem of a democratic society much worse, which is we are all born with a random genetic lottery, right? None of us get to choose what opportunities we are born with, what social strata we are born with, how much our parents earn, or any of that. And from John Rawls, who is a famous political philosopher, we know that the theory of justice in any democracy should be to level out these inequalities that you did not choose to be born with, the pure lottery. But now when you let colleges do this, what you are then inadvertently doing is, just by the mere fact that I go to a college in 2017 when I don't know about the pandemic, thinking that Delhi University is a great, just an example, is a great government college and I would get a good education there, versus a private college which I don't go to because it's expensive and it's not that good. But the private college conducts an exam and I get into the job market earlier, versus Delhi University does not conduct an exam because we have left everything to the colleges and I don't get into the job market. And that just worsens the entire problem of choice and something that you did not choose having bad consequences on you. And that's the exact opposite of what a democratic society should be doing. So while I agree with you on principle about decentralization, certain problems, when you decentralize them to the atomic level of a college, they actually make problems much worse, because you cannot leave it to individual colleges to do what they want. Because not every college has the same infrastructure. Not every college will, who gets to decide what skills a student is important for the school, or is important for the student in the job market. You cannot leave that to the college, right? Which is why you have a centralized body deciding what is important. Because if you leave it to colleges, depending on their own incentives, depending on whether they're a private college, how much money they make, the decisions they take would be very different. And that will affect the decades of lives that the students have invested in getting into that college, and the decades of lives that they will have after the college gets over is just left entirely to the whims and fancies of a few people that have no stake in the problem that they're deciding for. So, considering all of this, and it should be clear that I'm approaching this problem from a Rawlsian theory of justice, that the role of government is to iron out the inequalities that we were born with, that we did not choose to be born with, right? The analogy he gives is if you have a pizza party, for example, and you close your eyes, you want a society where if a pizza is randomly assigned to anyone, you have a good chance of getting an equitable share of the pizza as everyone else. You would much rather want to be born in that society versus another society where there is 2 very large pieces of pizza and hundreds of small ones. So the chances of you getting the big pizza are really small, but if you get them, then you're super rich. You wouldn't want to be in that society. You would much rather want to be in a society where the pizza is more equitably divided, where everyone has a chance of getting the pizza. So I don't see how leaving it to colleges is going to help us solve the problem at all, because that just fails this theory of justice.
Okay, so we're running a little close to the end of our time, guys. So let's just have some final thoughts. It's curious to me how we've ended up essentially tracing out the same path that we did in Tank Scrub on Thursday. We don't really have. I personally don't really have a clear preference even now. While I believe that the access to education has created new challenges in terms of inequality in India, and I definitely don't agree with having a one-size-fits-all policy. I'm also finding it a little difficult to kind of conceptualize how granular the policy would actually need to be to lead to an equitable outcome. So let me just get your final thoughts, and then we can leave it to our listeners to kind of figure out, given all this context that you guys have provided, what they think would be the ideal solution.
I empathize with how you're feeling about the situation, Anirudh, because I think from the beginning, most of these questions have been open questions. And if we had answers to them, we would have solved many problems we've already. So, an education itself is extremely difficult. I mean, for the longest time, it was very difficult to even measure what outcome a society would get from education. And every now and then, the jury is still out. Like for a lot of economists, education is only a signaling device. I think Nassim Nicholas Taleb also has something on this. But finally, I think overall, before we think of this as a bandage situation, we should be thinking about the larger picture. And like Atish said, the long term matters. And our challenges, it's not like we were in a good place and things have gotten worse. We were in a bad place and things have gotten worse. So our challenge is the necessity of fixing that challenge is only increased, and a band-aid solution may not be the ideal solution, is what I think.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that entirely. We do need reforms in order to make our education system better. The only reason why I was arguing for this is if we do nothing and let it be, and reforms do take time, even if not 2040, they're still going to take 5-6 years. The cohorts of students in between that are going to enter the job market, are going to enter college, school, are going to start their lives as earning citizens of this country, they are being affected by something that did not choose to. And that seems that seems the very thing that a government is in the power to stop happening, right? The role of the government for me is to stop these unintended consequences of something that is just beyond everyone else's control to make existing inequalities worse. So yes, we need reforms in education, and maybe 0 year is not the best idea, but what is the alternative? And if the alternative is to do nothing, I think that would be just a much, much worse policy than actually having a band-aid solution to something that might not even need a band-aid solution. Because doing something like this is better than doing nothing at all.
All right. Thank you both so much for joining us on today's episode. This is perhaps a little more of a debate than most All Things Policies episodes are, but hopefully we've given all of you, our listeners, some context on just how complicated and varied the effects of the pandemic are going to be, and the kind of imaginative policy making that is going to take to get us out of the problems that have been created. It's not going to be an easy process. It's going to be a process that's by definition unequal, that by definition requires some hard choices, and that's going to benefit some people more than others. But at the end of the day, it's going to have to be a solution that tries to maximize the potential benefits for India at large, and hoping that the costs that some Indians will have to face are not too bad at the end of the day. On that note, thank you all so much for listening to this episode of All Things Policy, and thank you, Saurabh and Atish, for joining us.
Thanks, Anirudh.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Another fun week in the books last week, and I think you guys should definitely check out some of the shows that we did. So first, let me tell you about Cock and Bull. We did 2 Cock and Bulls on Cyrus Says last week, which is, I don't think we've ever done before, but there was just so much to talk about, and it was fun. The first one was just on Trish, myself, and Cyrus. The second one, we had Abhijit Ganguly on, and that was a great episode. Do check that out. Check out Know Your Kanun as well. It's been a while since I spoke about that show, but Amber's been doing a great job on it. This week he spoke to Naina Sharma, a Canadian lawyer, about the ways that you do business in Canada and the challenges that presents. Definitely very interesting stuff. Do check that out. The guys at Naan Curry are doing some really, really fun stuff. Do check out their latest episode. They talk about roti, the simple bread, but it's got some complications to it. Let them tell you about what they are. Do check that out. Also, do definitely check out the Wire Talks with Siddharth Bhatia. He's been killing it, man. It's just a new show, but what great conversations. This week, he had Siddharth Singh on to talk about pollution. Do check that out. And you know what, guys? The best news of all, Simplified is back. They've been back for a few weeks and I haven't called them out before, but remember that they're back and do check them out. This week, they talk about, does censorship make sense? Knowing the guys, I think I know the answer to that, but you should go check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.